Hello, and welcome to Obscure History. Recently on the channel, we have been following the story of the Hellenistic juggernaut that was the Seleucid Empire. It is easy to get caught up with the larger entities of the Hellenistic period, such as Antigonid Macedon, Ptolemaic Egypt, and of course the Seleucids, as many of our surviving sources focus on these. I mentioned in the previous video that we would be continuing the series on the Seleucids, but after further consideration, I have decided to take a break from discussing the bigger kids on the block, so we can shift our narrative to one of the more minor contemporary players on the Hellenistic stage. Enter the Kingdom of Bithynia. Nestled along the northwestern coastline of Anatolia, the historic region known as Bithynia was at the crossroads of many civilizations. Widely credited as the West's first historian, Herodotus, writing in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, states that a Thracian tribe known as the Bithyni, along with members of another group called the Thuni, migrated from the Balkans eastwards, sometime between the Bronze Age collapse and the 700s BC. This migration seems to have been motivated by warfare, in which the Bithyni were the victims of another people group known as the Paeones. Crossing the Hellespont by 700 BC, the Thracian newcomers had managed to assimilate the existing Anatolian tribes inhabiting the other side of the crossing. From here on in, the Bithyni would be known as the Bithynians, and the region would be named after them. At around the same time, the Greeks began colonizing pockets along the Black Sea coastline, including areas around and within Bithynia. This includes the founding of settlements such as Chalcedon and Heracleia Pontica. We are unsure what the relationship was like between the Bithynians and Greeks, but it was most likely a mixture of positive relations with mutual exchange in goods and culture, as well as territorial skirmishes. Over time, the Greek influence on the Bithynians would grow substantially, but more on that later. By the mid-6th century BC, the Bithynians would become subjects of the Lydian king Croesus, before in turn being subjugated by the Achaemenid Persians under Cyrus the Great, becoming part of the larger satrapy of Hellespontine Phrygia, with the satrapal capital being based at Deucalion. For the next few centuries, the Bithynians would begrudgingly accept the rule of the King of Kings. That is, until a local Bithynian prince named Boethius declared the region's independence from the Persians. We have little information outside of his name and of his rebellion, but it seems the Bithynian people retained their independence right up until Alexander's invasion of the Persian Empire in 334 BC. After taking Deucalion following his first climactic clash at the Granicus River in the same year, Alexander's attention shifted southwards towards Sardis and the Ionian coastline. When it came to his invasion, Alexander had a one-track mind, that is, to take control of the regions that were still loyal to the King of Kings. Whilst little is known about the event and the man behind it, it is clear that Boethius played a critical role towards his people's independence, as Alexander's one-track mind would save them from further servitude or destruction. Leaving the area, Alexander appointed a Macedonian nobleman named Callas as governor of Hellespontine Phrygia. Seeing the region of Bithynia as rightfully his to govern, Callas moved into the area to subjugate the Thracians, but was met by the son of Boethius, Bas. Memnon of Heracleia, a Greek writer active in the 1st century AD, recounts that Bas defeated Callas and the Macedonians in a battle, but gives no details. Callas was a first cousin of Antigonus Monophthalmus the One-Eyed, so this was no small feat. The Bithynians would have been used to fighting as skirmishers due to their Thracian heritage, so this hit-and-run style of warfare could have given them the winning edge. Memnon also credits Bas with living to the age of 71 years with a 50-year-long reign, but the latter number is certainly not true, as we know that Petreius was still in charge at around 334 BC, and the son of Bas came to rule by 326 BC, whom we will discuss in a moment. I'd like to mention a side note regarding one of our main sources on this topic. The writings of Memnon of Heracleia is very interesting, as unlike other ancient writers who would often discuss places that are geographically removed from themselves, Memnon tends to discuss activities and events based around his hometown and the immediate surrounding areas. This different perspective makes his work sound more like local history, which in turn makes for a refreshing read. The reason why some of Memnon's more localized historical writings survived at all is because they were transcribed and compressed by another individual at another time. That person was Photios, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople in the late 800s AD. Without his preservation, Memnon's works may well have been lost to time due to how specific and niche they are, and we would therefore have less information on the rulers of Bithynia and indeed the region in general. Born in the year 354 BC, Zipoetes I came to rule over the Bithynians by 326 BC at the age of 28. The reign of Zipoetes is very significant within Bithynian history, as we know a great deal more about him. He is widely considered to be the first ruler of a fully unified Bithynian kingdom, as his actions helped to build it. Despite not having any connection whatsoever to Alexander or the Diadochi, Zipoetes decided he wanted Bithynia to be a part of the growing new Hellenistic world order. So far, the rulers of the Bithynian people were seen as no better than petty chieftains by the surrounding powers that be, but as we will see, Zipoetes would dedicate his lifetime to changing that perception. To start with, he would take on the Greek title of Basileus in 297 BC, marking the beginning of the Bithynian calendar, which would remain in use as late as the 5th century AD in parts of Anatolia. By the time of Zipoetes, we begin to see the Greco-Macedonian cultural influence really start to kick in. Most of the other Hellenistic states either struggled or did not even bother to assimilate the local peoples they ruled over, but in the case of Bithynia, Hellenization was greatly encouraged, and even the common person for the most part seemed to fully embrace it on a mass scale. An example of this is that people who had Thracian names began to give themselves Greek ones. The image displayed is almost definitely not Zipoetes, but a generic unnamed bust of a Hellenistic ruler, but it seemed fitting to use to portray him, given what we have just discussed regarding the increased Hellenization of the people. During his rule, Zipoetes had to contend with much larger powers and personalities surrounding him on all sides. He managed to wage successful wars against Lysimachus and Antiochus I Soter at different points in time. Bear in mind he had much fewer resources to work with than both, which are major achievements. He also squared off against Antigonus the One-Eyed, but failed in his campaign to take the cities of Chalcedon and Astacus, due to a reinforcing Antigonid army, so he waited cunningly until after Antigonus died at the Battle of Ipsus before taking both settlements. Astacus was burned to the ground, but this presented a golden PR opportunity for the Bithynian king. Zipoetes built upon the ashes to form a new city, and in true Hellenistic fashion, he named it after himself, Zipoetium, the location of which is unfortunately unknown. Despite all the odds, Zipoetes had managed to give every opportunity for his new kingdom to flourish as an independent player which now identified itself as Hellenic. Dying at the age of 76, he left 4 sons with the eldest one, Nicomedes I, succeeding him. Born in the year 300 BC, Nicomedes I succeeded his father in 278 BC. Like any normal older sibling, one of his first acts was to have his 3 younger brothers murdered to shore up his position. He was successful in killing 2 of them, but the third, named Zipoetes, was able to escape and raise a rebellion. Historians have dubbed him Zipoetes II, as he was able to control a portion of the kingdom for a few years. This then leads us to an event that we have already covered during the reign of the Seleucid monarch Antiochus I, but I will mention it briefly again as it continues our current narrative. It was this Nicomedes in the same year of 278 that had invited the Celtic Galatians over from Europe to combat his troublesome brother. Ferrying them over with his fleet, Nicomedes used the Galatians to finally defeat his brother and reunite the Bithynian kingdom, but it came at the expense of everyone else around him. Growing bored of their victory, the Galatians hungrily eyed the rest of Anatolia and saw it ripe for plundering. Whilst his neighbours probably did not take too kindly in his role in unleashing the barbarian menace, the Bithynians themselves praised Nicomedes as their sole ruler. Not much is recorded in the historical narrative about Nicomedes until in 264 BC, when he built a new capital for the kingdom. Named after himself, of course, Nicomedia would grow to become one of the major trading centres of Anatolia, serving as an important base for the later Roman and Eastern Roman empires. An important fact about the new capital was that it housed the main coin mint for the kingdom. Nicomedes I can lay claim to have minted the first coinage of the kingdom's existence, with a handful of large silver tetradrachma being uncovered bearing the bust of the king himself in typical Hellenistic style, like the one shown on screen. However, as we look at the coin's reverse, they provide us with a reminder that the Bithynians themselves were once newcomers to a foreign land. The enthroned figure has been identified as the Thracian deity Bendis, who was the goddess of the moon and hunting. This shows us that despite the massive cultural shift, the Bithynian people never forgot where they came from. With this example, we can easily imagine the mixed worship of both Greek and Thracian deities side by side. Before dying at the age of 45 in 255 BC, Nicomedes had two wives, each bearing sons. The second wife, named Etazeta, had managed to persuade Nicomedes to pass on the line of succession through her children. Upon the death of Nicomedes, Etazeta ruled as queen regent in her son's stead for a few years, but during that time, the son from the first marriage, named Zilas, was pretty mad at this arrangement, and so he decided to act. Fleeing the kingdom that he rightfully saw as his and his alone, the teenage Zilas fled to the court of King Arsames I of Armenia. With the backing of the Galatians, Zilas was able to make a lightning strike takeover of Bithynia by 254 BC, officially making him the third Basileus. Azitas and her children were able to escape the kingdom to Antigonus II Gonatas in Macedon, who had lent his support to the now exiled region in the past. Our sources go quiet on Zilas's earlier years in power, which could indicate that he enjoyed some measure of stability despite the initial unrest. Zilas continued the minting of coinage, but only a few of these have been uncovered. In 245 BC, Zilas married one of his daughters to the ambitious Seleucid prince Antiochus Hierax, which created an alliance and personal connection between the two men. Other than that, the only other thing we know about Zilas was that his son Perusius I took over the reins of power by 228 BC, after he was killed by none other than the Galatians. Perusius I succeeded Zilas in 228 BC and enjoyed a very healthy reign of 46 years. Early in his reign, Perusius was able to seal an alliance with Demetrius II of Macedon by taking the Macedonian king's daughter Apama as his wife. This union would eventually give Perusius his son and successor, Perusius II. During his long rule, he would prove to be the most energetic king of Bithynia since Zipoetes I proclaimed himself Basileus of the dynasty. Kickstarting his time in charge, Perusius sought to avenge his father's death by crushing the same Galatians in battle. We are then grimly informed that he had all the women and children executed, and the enemy's valuables were swiftly confiscated. Between 214 to 205 BC, the First Macedonian War was raging against Rome and Philip V of Macedon in Greece. King Attalus I joined the conflict on the side of the Romans and had sailed from Anatolia to assist his ally, but this presented an enticing opportunity for Perusius. With Philip prompting him to attack, and with the promise of more coastal settlements, now would be the time for Perusius to begin expanding his influence. After all, there were many Greek settlements dotting the neighbouring region of Mysia, which would help facilitate further Hellenization of the kingdom. Instigating what essentially was an extension to the Macedonian War in Europe, Perusius was able to take several small towns, but the biggest prize of all was the Greek port city of Chios, located along the coast of the Sea of Marmara. Taking after the many other Hellenic monarchs of his day, Perusius renamed it to Perusius ad Mare, Perusius on the sea. Hostilities between the two small kingdoms ceased by 205 BC, when the Treaty of Phoenice was signed between all parties involved in the First Macedonian War, and by extension this included Pergamon and Bithynia. It seems then that Perusius's gambit had paid off, as he was able to retain his new possessions without reprimand. He was also able to successfully stay neutral in the conflict between Rome and the Seleucids between 192 and 188 BC, despite an alliance proposed by the Seleucid Basileus Antiochus Megas the Great, which Perusius refused. He would, however, make war with a more manageable power, the polis of Heracleia Pontica. We once again turn to Memnon of Heracleia on the following for our source, for Perusius made war against this Greek city and its dependent territories. First he captured the town of Cerion, and then took another settlement called Tius. Both of these towns were under the jurisdiction of Heracleia, and were on both sides of the polis. This meant that Heracleia itself was now surrounded by hostile territory. Memnon informs us that when Perusius arrived at Heracleia, he subjugated it with a severe siege, and killed many of those who were besieged. The city was close to being captured, but whilst climbing a ladder, Perusius was hit with a stone which was thrown off the battlements. He broke his leg, and this resulted in the siege being lifted. Earning himself the nickname Colus the Lame, the Bithynians carried their king on a litter back to their lands, where he would live on for a few more years. By the end of the Roman-Seleucid War in 189 BC, tensions between Bithynia and Pergamon would once again flare up. This time, however, Perusius was eager to employ the skills of a new arrival to his court against the latter. That new arrival happened to be the boogeyman of Rome itself, Hannibal. The famous Carthaginian general first sought refuge in Bithynia after being in the service of the Seleucid king Antiochus III, following his exile from Carthage after the Second Punic War. After the Roman-Seleucid War, Hannibal feared that Antiochus would hand him over to the Romans as part of the peace terms. When he arrived in Bithynia, Hannibal agreed to take on the fight against Pergamon on Perusius's behalf. During a naval engagement, Hannibal used a very unconventional method of fighting his foes by loading amphorae with venomous snakes. This action apparently caused so much panic amongst the Pergamene fleet that it won Bithynia the battle. Rome caught wind that their greatest adversary was under the employment of Perusius and was attacking their ally. They threatened him to hand the Carthaginian over. Not wanting to bring the fires of certain destruction onto his kingdom for one man, Perusius agreed to the terms. But fate put Hannibal on a different course, as depending on which account is viewed, he died most likely of poisoning. Ancient writers of the time, such as Livy and Cornelius Nepos, recount how, after finding that his place of residence was surrounded by Roman soldiers, he took his own life through poisoning. Appian, interestingly, writes differently in that it was Perusius himself who had him poisoned. Should Appian's account be true, then it was most likely meant as a mercy killing for the famous terror of Rome. It would not be too long after Hannibal that Prusius I Colus died in 182 BC at 61 years old. He has the distinction of being the first Basileus of Bithynia to receive a nickname, and would be remembered as arguably one of their greatest leaders. Prusius II Cynicus was born in the year 220 BC and experienced a smooth transition to power after his father's death in 182 BC. His nickname, Cynicus, means the hunter, which is much better than the lame. Although we're not sure how he acquired such a name, it could be argued that it was wasted on him given what we know. Of the two tetradrachma shown on screen, the left bust is of Prusius II, with the right one being his successor, who I've decided to talk about jointly in this segment. Within his first year in power, he decided to go against his father's policy of waging the usual wars with Pergamon by allying with their king Eumenes II against a new joint foe, Pharnaces I of Pontus. This alliance seems to have been defensive in nature, but nothing noteworthy survives in the written record about Prusius's involvement in this conflict. The resulting peace in 179 BC saw Bithynian influence grow in the neighbouring region of Paphlagonia, but this would partially play into future conflict with Pontus under its greatest king, but more on that later. In 178 BC, Prusius married the sister of the last Antigonid monarch of Macedon, Perseus. Epitome IV and Prusius II were maternal cousins, so with regards to family connections, Bithynia was now firmly following in the footsteps of all the other Hellenistic powers. At some point, he was favoured by the Aetolian League in Greece, so much that they erected a stele at Delphi for his positive conduct towards them. Skipping ahead to 156 BC, Prusius decided to attack his one-time ally of Pergamon. I guess some good things just cannot last forever. For whatever his reasons, Prusius wanted to make war with his former ally's son and then king Attalus II. This proved to be a blunder, as Attalus had very strong ties to the Roman Republic, and with their assistance, Prusius was defeated, and by 154 BC, he had to sign a humiliating treaty in which Pergamon demanded heavy war reparations. This included 500 talents and 20 fully decked out warships. Appian gives us a detailed account of Prusius's final years and eventual downfall. Bitter of the defeat, Prusius soon became a cruel man. As a result, the average Bithynian grew to despise their leader, and they began to greatly attach themselves to his son, the future Nicomedes II, who seemed to be quite likable and charismatic compared to his father. Not learning from the mistake of Nicomedes I, Prusius had a second wife and wanted the royal line to continue with the children born of that union. This proved to work in the favour of the soon-to-be Nicomedes II, as he was already old enough to rule by this time, and so was probably seen as the more obvious choice of successor by the majority of the people. Seeing that the opinion of the populace was so low, and growing suspicious of his own son, Prusius dispatched Nicomedes to seek an audience with the Senate in Rome to attempt to reduce the harshness of the war reparations. He was accompanied by another ambassador, Menas, who Prusius had secretly instructed to have Nicomedes assassinated should the mission fail. At the same time, a military man named Andronicus was sent by Attalus II to argue the case in favour of Pergamon, which eventually won out. The Senate ordered that the remaining payment was still due, and Nicomedes had failed in his mission. With the outcome now decided, the agent of Prusius should have carried out his bloody business there and then. But on account of his estimable and attractive character, Menas was at a loss on what to do. He could not possibly kill him, nor return back to Bithynia without carrying out the deed. Along the journey back home, Nicomedes and Menas held a meeting in Bernice, a town in Ephesus, in which the latter revealed the plot in its entirety to the prince. Nicomedes had the pretext he needed to overthrow his father, and with the help from the Pergamene ambassador Andronicus, a plan was hatched that very night. Come the next morning, Nicomedes walked onto the deck of his ship, wearing the royal diadem and purple attire of a Hellenistic monarch. In front of his 2,000-man guard, Andronicus hailed him as king. Seeing the acclaim, Menas pretended to be surprised by the whole ordeal and joined in on the spectacle. Quoting Appian directly, Menas reportedly says the following, quote, "Since we have two kings, one at home and one other going there, we must look out for our own interests and form a careful judgment of the future, because our safety lies in foreseeing correctly which of them will be the stronger. One of them is an old man, the other is young. The Bithynians are averse to Perusius, they are attached to Nicomedes. The leading Romans are fond of the young man, and Andronicus has already furnished him a guard, showing that Nicomedes is in alliance with Attalus, who rules an extensive dominion alongside the Bithynians and is an old enemy of Perusius." In addition to this speech, Menas leaned heavily into the cruelty of Perusius and that he does not hold even the smallest amount of respect by the common person of the country. Hearing all this, the Pergamene soldiers were disgusted of the character of Perusius. Menas led another cheer for the new king of Bithynia, and the soldiers all soon joined in. Using this 2,000-strong Pergamene detachment as his starting point, Nicomedes marched across northern Greece and Thrace and reached Bithynia. King Attalus of Pergamon lent his full support of the usurpation, supplying further troops to help Nicomedes. Seeing his support quickly melting away on all directions, Perusius II Cynicus was forced to abdicate by 149 BC, and was quickly put to death soon afterwards. Nicomedes II soon took the nickname Epiphanes, meaning God Manifest. During his 22-year tenure as Basileus, Nicomedes was a steady ally to both Rome and Pergamon. When Attalus III died in 133 BC, he left in his will that the Pergamene kingdom be absorbed into the Roman Republic. Not everyone, of course, was on board with this, however, as a pretender named Aristonicus stylized himself as Eumenes III and began to fight back. Nicomedes happily assisted the Republic in bringing the pretender down, and by 129 BC, both Bithynia and Rome were able to put down the revolt. Administratively, Nicomedes II introduced the Bithynian calendar on their coinage. Apart from this minor detail, we know little else of his reign. Apart from the revolt of Eumenes III, he seemed to have ruled over a time of peace and prosperity for the Bithynians. This would prove to be the calm before the storm, however, a storm that his son and successor would have to endure. Nicomedes II Epiphanes died peacefully in the year 127 BC at the capital of Nicomedia of old age. His son, named after his father, took on the mantle of Basileus after him. Nicomedes III Euergetes, the benefactor, inherited the quiet and stable kingdom his father had built, but that was all about to change. The following mostly comes from Appian, within his account of the Mithridatic Wars, as well as Justinus's Historiae Philippicae. By 108 BC, Nicomedes sought out an alliance with the ambitious Pontic king Mithridates VI. The two kings agreed to attack the region of Paphlagonia at the same time and partition the region. The plan worked, as the ruling Paphlagonian dynasty was overwhelmed by the sudden attack from two directions. When the Roman Senate learned of these developments, they sent ambassadors to both kings. With his growing arrogance, Mithridates argued that his father had ruled parts of the country, and the Romans made no protest then, so why should they now? Nicomedes, for his part, admitted that the Bithynians never formally held dominion in Paphlagonia, and so he vowed to restore the previous ruling dynasty. In truth, however, he renamed one of his sons to Philomenes, which was a common name of the previous rulers, and installed him there, allowing Nicomedes to claim he had restored his part of the country to the previous rulers, whilst continuing to rule it through proxy himself. Long after this partition, Nicomedes quickly came to understand that the Pontic ruler would not be content with only half the prize. Seeing the inevitable clash, Nicomedes began building an anti-Mithridatic coalition which included the kingdom of Cappadocia under its king Ariarathes VI Epiphanes. Mithridates learned of this and used a Cappadocian nobleman, Gordius, to successfully have the king murdered. After the murder, the widow of Ariarathes and the sister of Mithridates, Laodice, ruled jointly with her son Ariarathes VII Philometor, briefly before Nicomedes began to occupy the country, using the pretext of defending his now dead ally's interests to invade. He was also married to a daughter of Ariarathes named Nisa, who at some point gave birth to the final king of an independent Bithynia, Nicomedes IV. Angry at his former ally's impediments to his plans, Mithridates launched his own offensive into Cappadocia, declaring that he was, as Appian puts it, to protect his sister. But Laodice was not as defenseless as Mithridates made her out to be, as he learned that she sent a marriage proposal to Nicomedes, which would have stabilized the situation in Cappadocia. Mithridates, on the other hand, saw that his plans to incorporate Cappadocia into his growing domains was quickly slipping away from him. Acting decisively and disregarding Laodice's marriage proposal, Mithridates continued his invasion into Cappadocia and managed to push all the Bithynian garrisons out of the region. He then confirmed Ariarathes VII as king, but a dispute between the two kings during a banquet soon led to Mithridates personally killing his nephew and installing his own son, Ariarathes Eusebius, on the throne. Further backwards and forwards over the issue of Cappadocia ensued, including Mithridates involving his own father-in-law, the equally ambitious Tigranes II of Armenia, who ousted the Roman-backed Ariobarzanes I Philoremoios from the country to restore the region back to Mithridatic control after the Cappadocian people had revolted and killed the puppet ruler Ariarathes Eusebius. Nicomedes III Euergetes, for his part, would not live to see the end of these troubling times. Diadotus Siculus, writing around the same time as the events being discussed, gives us an interesting story concerning Nicomedes III. In 104 BC, the Senate had requested that Bithynia send allied troops to help in the Cimbrian War led by Gaius Marius. Nicomedes declined the request, stating that most of the Bithynians had been taken away as slaves by tax collectors or were dispersed throughout the Roman-held provinces. Acting on this information, the Senate agreed that no freedman of any ally of Rome in any province should be forced into slavery, and that the praetors should see to it that they were all set free. Dying in 94 BC, it would be left to his son and successor to see the Bithynian kingdom through the Mithridatic Wars. Inheriting the throne of Bithynia during a tumultuous time, Nicomedes IV Philopator, meaning father-loving, found himself the target of Mithridates, who began testing the eastern Bithynian border. By 90 BC, Mithridates made the half-brother of Nicomedes IV, a man named Socrates Crestius, as a rival claimant to the Bithynian throne. Lending him an army, Mithridates successfully displaced Nicomedes and put Socrates in charge of the country. Appian credits Socrates as a reluctant character who did not want to seize power. Now a king without a kingdom to rule, Nicomedes IV set sail for Rome to plead his case to the Senate. At the same time, Mithridates dispatched an emissary of his own to Rome to ask that Socrates be recognized as the king of Bithynia. Both were presented to the Senate at the same time to weigh the matter accordingly. Once the Pontic delegation had finished speaking, those that had followed Nicomedes into exile spoke the following according to Appian, quote, Mithridates plotted against Nicomedes long ago and put Socrates on the throne by force and arms, though Socrates was of a quiet disposition and thought it right that his elder brother should reign. This was the act of Mithridates to Nicomedes, whom you, Romans, had established on the throne of Bithynia, a blow which was evidently aimed as much at you as at us. In like manner, after you had commanded the Asiatic kings not to molest Europe, he seized the greater part of Kerenissos. Let these acts stand as examples of his arrogance, his hostility, his disobedience towards yourselves. Look at his great preparations. He stands in complete readiness, as for a great and predetermined war, not merely with his own army, but with great force of allies, Thracians, Scythians, and many other neighboring peoples. He has formed a marriage alliance with Armenia, and is sent to Egypt and Syria to make friends with the kings of those countries. He has 300 ships of war, and is still adding to the number. He has sent for Phoenicia and Egypt for naval officers and steersmen. These things that Mithridates is collecting in such vast quantities are not designed for Nicomedes, nay, O Romans, but for you. He is angry with you, because when he had bought Phrygia by a corrupt bargain from one of your generals, you ordered him to give up his ill-gotten gains. He is angry on account of Cappadocia, which was given by you to Ariobarzanes. He fears your increasing power. He is making preparations under pretense that they are intended for us, but he means to attack you if he can. It will be the part of wisdom not to wait till he declares war against you, but to look at his deeds rather than his words, and not to give up true and tried friends for a hypocrite who offers you the fictitious name of friendship, nor allow your decision concerning our kingdom to be annulled by one who is equally the foe of both of us. Once all this was said, the Senate had made their decision. Socrates was not to be recognized as the legitimate king, and that they would help restore both Nicomedes and Ariobarzanes to their rightful positions. And so, with the backing of Roman soldiers based in what was once the kingdom of Pergamon, now the Roman province of Asia, under the general Manlius Aquilius, Nicomedes succeeded in counter-ousting his half-brother from the kingdom, and Ariobarzanes was also reinstated in Cappadocia by 89 BC. Socrates at first fled to the city of Cyzicus, and later to the island of Euboea, where Mithridates had him killed. Now in charge again, Nicomedes wanted revenge for his humiliating flight. His anger was further fueled by Aquilius, who goaded him into launching a joint attack into Pontic territory. Letting his desire for vengeance get the better of him, Nicomedes and Aquilius began devastating the Pontic-controlled areas of Paphlagonia, but this would prove to be a disaster. Responding to the raid with swift harshness, Mithridates launched a counterattack which led to the defeat of the joint Roman and Bithynian army. Aquilius escaped, but was later captured and had molten gold poured down his throat, and Nicomedes fled to Rome once again. The legions under Marcus Cornelius Sulla managed to defeat Mithridates in the First Mithridatic War, and by 84 BC he was enthroned for the third time. The last few years of Nicomedes IV's disjointed rule proved to be more peaceful, but it came at the cost of heavy Roman influence, as Mithridates was still at large. Famously, in 80 BC, a young Gaius Julius Caesar was dispatched as an ambassador to Bithynia. The aim of his mission was to help Nicomedes raise a fleet using the kingdom's resources. The young Caesar, had stayed in Bithynia for so long that rumours soon circulated back in Rome that both he and the old king had become lovers, leading to his contemporaries mockingly calling him the Queen of Bithynia. Although strongly denying it under oath, the mockery would continue to plague Caesar later in his life. After his infamous conquest of Gaul, people could be heard saying, Caesar had laid the Gauls low, but Nicomedes laid Caesar lower, suggesting that Caesar was the submissive in the theoretical relationship. Rumours of the sexual kind aside, in 74 BC, Nicomedes would declare in his will that the Bithynian kingdom would pass to the Senate and people of Rome. With no male heirs to act as the line of succession, and with the continuing looming threat of Mithridates of Pontus, it was clear to Nicomedes that the price for his people's continued future lay as another Roman province rather than an independent kingdom. Shortly after making this decision, Nicomedes IV Philopator passed on to the afterlife as Bithynia's last independent ruler. Upon his death, the Senate immediately ratified the will, and with the exception of the brief takeover by Mithridates shortly afterwards, Bithynia would remain under Roman and later Eastern Roman rule for over 1,250 years. The story of the Bithynian people is one of continual independence despite being a relatively small fish in a big pond. Starting out as a herdspeople from Europe, they found themselves in strange and unfamiliar lands, but were able to adapt their cultural identity to the flourishing Hellenistic world while still retaining practices from their Thracian ancestors. Their chieftains turned themselves into kings, taking on the title of Basileus, and in the Hellenic spirit, they ruled over their slice of Anatolia for over 230 years as a proud people. Thank you for tuning in. I have enjoyed researching this smaller Hellenistic state, and I hope you have equally enjoyed listening in as we have put the spotlight on it. On our next discussion, we will return to our favourite Hellenistic juggernaut, the Seleucid Empire. Feel free to like and comment if you have found anything discussed to be of interest. Until next time, this has been Obscure History.